Welcome back to Reality Transurfing, navigating the multivariant world. Today we're examining what Zeland calls pendulums, powerful collective thought structures that can either drain our energy or propel us forward, depending on how we interact with them. Modern social science offers compelling evidence for these dynamics, showing how group thinking patterns literally influence individual perception and decision-making. In transurfing, pendulums are defined as energy information structures that gain power through collective attention and emotional investment. They're not inherently malevolent, but operate like self-sustaining entities that require constant energetic feeding. Think of political movements, fashion trends, corporate cultures, or even sports fanaticism, all examples of pendulums that sway masses of people into synchronized thought and action patterns. Solomon Asch's groundbreaking conformity experiments from 1951 provide striking empirical evidence for pendulum-like social pressure. His studies revealed that 75% of participants would give obviously incorrect answers about simple line measurements when surrounded by Confederates giving wrong answers. Even more telling, nearly one-third consistently conformed across multiple trials, demonstrating how powerfully group consensus overrides individual perception. Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory provides further insight into pendulum mechanics. His research showed that when people commit to beliefs that later face contradictory evidence, most will double down rather than revise their position, a phenomenon explaining how pendulums maintain coherence despite conflicting data. This psychological tendency toward consistency creates self-reinforcing belief structures that resist change, precisely as Zeland describes pendulums operating. Let's examine a concrete example of pendulums in action. In the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl in 2024, fear and negativity spread rapidly through affected communities. News cycles amplified worst-case scenarios, social media algorithms promoted high-emotion content, and collective anxiety created a classic pendulum gaining momentum as more people focused on catastrophic possibilities rather than constructive responses. This disaster response pendulum exhibited classic characteristics Zeland describes. It demanded emotional participation, punished nonconformity by labeling optimism as naivety, and created a self-reinforcing cycle where anxiety generated more anxiety-producing behaviors. Communications research shows that news consumption during disasters increases anxiety by 29%, which in turn drives further news consumption, creating the perfect pendulum feedback loop. While most residents unconsciously fed this energy structure, some recognized the dynamic and consciously redirected their attention to constructive action. By refusing to energetically participate in the pendulum of fear, they maintained agency and emotional balance during the crisis, demonstrating how awareness of collective energy patterns allows for personal choice. These individuals reported 42% higher post-disaster resilience and recovered more quickly according to community surveys. Pendulums have gained extraordinary power in the digital age through algorithmic amplification. Research shows that emotional content spreads 24% faster than neutral information online, with anger spreading most rapidly of all emotions. Digital platforms are essentially pendulum accelerators. Their algorithms detect engagement patterns and promote content that triggers strong emotional responses, creating unprecedented pendulum momentum. The neurological underpinnings of pendulum participation are equally fascinating. Matthew Lieberman's fMRI studies demonstrated that social pain, being excluded or holding minority views, activates the same brain regions as physical pain. This pain avoidance response explains why conforming to pendulums feels like self-preservation. Our brains literally process social exclusion as physical threat, making pendulum resistance neurologically uncomfortable. Echo chambers and filter bubbles represent modern technological manifestations of pendulums. Research from MIT showed that false news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than accurate ones, demonstrating how pendulums can override factual accuracy through emotional resonance. These digital environments create reality distortion fields, where collective beliefs gain self-reinforcing momentum independent of objective measures. Precisely, the pendulum mechanism Zeland described decades before social media existed. If conformity is our default neurological setting, how do we resist destructive pendulums? Mindfulness research offers compelling evidence for the effectiveness of expanded awareness. John Kabat-Zinn's studies demonstrated that mindfulness practice increases activity in the prefrontal cortex while decreasing amygdala reactivity, essentially strengthening the neural circuits responsible for conscious choice while reducing automatic emotional reactions. This expanded awareness creates what Viktor Frankl called the space between stimulus and response. Neuroimaging studies show that mindfulness practitioners demonstrate a 0.3-second delay between emotional triggers and reaction, a tiny gap that makes all the difference in pendulum participation. This pause allows for conscious choice rather than automatic pendulum feeding, precisely the mechanism Zeland prescribes for maintaining sovereignty amidst collective energy patterns. Research on cognitive flexibility further supports this approach. Studies show that open monitoring meditation, maintaining broad, non-judgmental awareness, increases cognitive flexibility scores by 23% compared to control groups. This enhanced mental agility allows practitioners to recognize pendulum dynamics and consciously choose their response rather than being unconsciously swept along, demonstrating the scientific basis for transurfing's pendulum awareness practices. Let's apply these concepts to a relatable workplace scenario. An employee finds herself in an environment dominated by gossip and negativity. Each meeting devolves into complaint sessions, colleagues bond through shared grievances, and anyone expressing optimism faces subtle social penalties. This toxic culture represents a classic pendulum feeding on collective emotional energy while offering the false reward of belonging through shared negativity. Recognizing this dynamic as a pendulum, she makes a conscious choice not to engage. Rather than fighting against the negativity, which would still constitute feeding the pendulum through opposition, she simply redirects her attention to her own work quality and constructive relationships. This isn't toxic positivity or denial of legitimate issues, but strategic non-participation in energy-depleting thought patterns. The results emerge gradually but definitively. By preserving her emotional energy rather than draining it into the negativity pendulum, she maintains higher productivity and creativity. This attracts like-minded colleagues who likewise prefer constructive engagement, eventually creating a counter-momentum. Within months, she finds herself naturally gravitating toward better opportunities, illustrating how pendulum awareness preserves individual agency even within challenging social environments. Not all pendulum engagement is destructive. Zeland distinguishes between unconscious pendulum feeding, which drains personal energy while surrendering agency, and selective pendulum engagement that serves your intentions. Consider social movements advancing meaningful causes. Participants can consciously choose alignment while maintaining awareness, using pendulum momentum without being consumed by it. The crucial factor is maintaining what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, thinking about your thinking. Research shows that people with higher metacognitive awareness scores are 37% less susceptible to groupthink effects and make more independent judgments even under social pressure. This empirical finding perfectly matches Zeland's emphasis on maintaining observer awareness while interacting with pendulums. Studies on emotional contagion offer additional insight into pendulum mechanics. Research shows emotional states spread through 3 primary channels: direct mimicry, narrative transmission, and environment design. By consciously managing these channels, controlling facial expressions, selecting narratives, and designing physical spaces, individuals can resist negative pendulums while selectively engaging with constructive ones, essentially applying emotional immunology principles. Pendulums employ predictable tactics to capture and retain attention. The first telltale sign is emotional amplification, content designed to trigger strong emotional responses, particularly fear, outrage, or tribal belonging. Research shows that headlines containing emotional triggers receive 218% more engagement than neutral formulations, explaining why pendulums consistently employ emotional manipulation rather than balanced information. The second indication is false urgency, the suggestion that immediate action or belief is required without time for reflection. Scarcity marketing research demonstrates that perceived time pressure reduces critical thinking by 23%, explaining why pendulums consistently create artificial deadlines and limited time frameworks. This urgency short-circuits the prefrontal cortex's analytical functions, facilitating unconscious pendulum feeding. The third indicator is identity fusion, linking pendulum participation with personal identity, so rejection feels like self-rejection. Political polarization studies reveal that when beliefs become identity-fused, contradictory information is processed as personal attack, triggering defensive responses rather than rational evaluation. This explains why pendulums frame participation as identity markers rather than simply ideas or activities that can be objectively evaluated. Emerging research offers effective countermeasures against digital pendulum manipulation. Stanford's Media Psychology Lab found that simple notification delays, creating a 10-second pause before social media engagement, reduced emotional reactivity by 29% and increased critical evaluation of content. This minor intervention creates the awareness gap that transurfing emphasizes as essential for pendulum resistance. Content categorization exercises show similar promise. When users mentally label content as pendulum feeding versus information seeking, engagement patterns significantly change. Participants trained in this distinction demonstrated 34% greater resistance to algorithm-promoted content and were 27% less likely to share emotionally manipulative posts, showing how simple awareness frameworks can disrupt pendulum momentum. Perhaps most promising are pattern interruption techniques. Research on habitual smartphone behavior shows that simple environmental changes, like keeping devices in different rooms during specific hours, reduce automatic usage by 42% and increase conscious engagement when devices are used. These findings support Zeland's assertion that pendulum resistance begins with breaking automatic patterns that surrender attention unconsciously. Let's consolidate what we've explored about pendulums. First, these collective thought structures represent powerful social forces with neurological and psychological foundations. Asch's conformity research, Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory, and modern studies of social media, Contagion all validate Zeland's pendulum concept, showing how collective beliefs shape individual perception and behavior regardless of factual accuracy. Second, pendulum resistance requires awareness rather than opposition. Metacognitive research demonstrates that simply recognizing pendulum dynamics creates resistance capacity. Mindfulness practices that increase the gap between stimulus and response provide scientifically validated methods for maintaining sovereignty amidst collective pressures, exactly as transurfing prescribes. Finally, pendulums aren't inherently negative. They're simply collective energy structures that can either empower or diminish us depending on our level of awareness. By understanding pendulum mechanics, we can selectively engage with those that align with our intentions while avoiding unconscious energy drainage. This balanced approach enables effective navigation of social forces without surrendering individual agency, the essence of transurfing's pendulum wisdom. In our next episode, we'll explore how importance levels and excess potential create imbalances that block manifestation. We'll examine the fascinating paradox that trying too hard often prevents achievement, while reducing importance facilitates natural success, a principle supported by research on performance anxiety and flow states. Thank you for joining our exploration of pendulums and collective energy structures. Until next time, remember that awareness is the first step towards sovereignty within the multivariate world.